heard of the genderbread person or the gender unicorn or just the traditional way of thinking about gender that we learned in elementary school. But I'm here to tell you that I don't think any of those concepts do the job justice of explaining gender and sex. I don't think any of those frameworks are accurate. So I just made up my own story of my life. I see that something doesn't make sense to me, I just make up my own. And you'll see that a lot on this YouTube channel as well as on my TikTok. Anyway, one of the things that I like to do when I'm organizing my thoughts is to create diagrams, and I figured, you know what, I bet other people could benefit from the diagrams that I have in my head. And long form content is much better suited to YouTube than TikTok, so here we are. So the gender cake has 5 tiers, and all 5 of these tiers are important. I know that a lot of people would disagree for various reasons, and I'm going to start this presentation by explaining that to you. Okay, there we go. So a lot of times what we see is the political right will say, oh, we actually don't need gender identity. That's garbage and stupid and doesn't make any sense, and we only recognize biological gender as a real concept. But then the political left says, actually, it's the opposite. We only recognize gender identity as the real concept, and biogender is useless and we can just do away with it completely. There's no such thing. I disagree with both of these perspectives, which gets me in a lot of hot water on a website where there can't really be videos long enough to give nuance to any sort of complicated conversation like this. So, my whole argument is that there is value in both biogender and gender identity, and it is possible to respect everyone regardless of which one of those cake tiers they prioritize. This framework that I'm explaining to you today will hopefully make that make sense. So, to start off, I want to talk about the left-hand phrases that you're about to see pop up on the screen, and this gender cake overview video is the only video where I'm going to go really in depth into discussing them. So starting from the bottom, we have biological sex. Now, biological sex is a purely physical concept. I know that many people want to conflate biological sex with emotions and gender identity, and that is not sensible because gender identity, totally valid, but it has its own tier, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But biological sex is where the whole thing starts because that's how humans are born. It is purely about the reproductive system, which is why it's called the physical tier and why there are no other words describing it, just physical. In this case, physical means gametes, but we'll get to gametes in a second. The next tier up is biogender, which is a shortened form of biological gender. Now, like I said before, there are a lot of people out there who think that gender is purely a social construct in 100% of situations and that there is no such thing as a behavior that could have a biological basis. And part of the purpose of this video is to explain that that's not true. There are certain behaviors that are specifically related to the gametes that you produce. So if you are a biological female, you are statistically significantly more likely to engage in certain behaviors, and if you are a biological male, you are statistically significantly more likely to engage in certain behaviors. Now, are there outliers? There are always outliers in any kind of statistic, right? But just because there is an exception to the rule does not negate the existence of the rule. And I think the reason why in modern times people have started to feel that way, that the exception negates the rule, is because we treat, as a society in general, we treat people who are exceptions to the rule like shit. And so if you're going to treat people badly, then they're going to look for reasons why they're not an exception to the rule instead of just deciding, well, fuck what everybody else thinks. Why? Because that's harder. It is so much harder to be like, who cares what everybody thinks, than it is to try to shoehorn yourself into what everybody else says is normal. And that's okay, because I think that's just kind of part of the human experience to deal with that, you know? But once you do, you feel so much better because it's like the things that people say just roll off your back, like the duck, like a duck. So anyway, starts with physical only, which is the gametes, and then goes up to physical plus biobehavioral, which means gametes plus the behaviors that you are more likely to engage in because of your biological sex. And we, again, have a whole video about this. Now, we get to our first red bar, which is meant to separate the physical from the emotional. And once we cross that red bar, we get into the emotional tiers of the cake. Emotional plus socio-behavioral is gender identity. So gender identity is how you identify. Again, there is an entire video about that, so I'm not going to get too deep into it in the overview. I want to focus on what socio-behavioral means, and in order to do that, I need to contrast it with biobehavioral. So biobehavioral was rooted in the physicality of it all, right? It was rooted in the gametes. However, socio-behavioral is rooted in emotions on a sociological scale. So the emotions of society, of the general public, influence gender identity. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to cringe at this idea immediately, and they're going to say, I don't like that. I am my own person. Society doesn't have any effect on me. But I think we would all be lying if we said that, to be quite honest with you. And the reason why I'm being so firm with that statement is because none of us grew up in a vacuum, right? If you are reading this, no matter how old you are, it's not like you grew up in an island raised by robots, right? You had influence by other humans. You've been influenced by other human beings, whether it's just your parents, family, friends, church members, schoolmates. It goes on and on and on, right? People on TV even, especially the media, especially with social media these days. Of course, your brain is seeing experiences of other people and recording that information, even if you are not consciously aware of it. And a lot of human beings are not conscious of why we do things. We will tell ourselves, I do this because of this. And then you find out in therapy, you actually do it for completely different reasons. So I think it's unfair to ourselves as members of society to claim that this opinions of society were completely unrelated to how we formed our opinions about our own gender identity. So it is emotional, but socio-behavioral is also a factor. That being said, that leads us to gender expression, which is purely emotional and based on how we feel on any given moment, on any given day. Now, there are some people who feel very similar from day to day, and so what you will see in their expression is that they choose to have, very similar style. On the spectrum of masculinity and femininity, they tend to stay in a very, very small spectrum of that, of that larger continuum, and that's okay. But then there are also people who switch it up a lot, and they are going back and forth, making huge differences in how they express themselves on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, month-to-month basis, etc. Or maybe sliding back and forth rather than doing hard switches. Regardless of how people express, that is the emotional tier. So it can change very quickly based on how people feel, and sometimes people just feel very similar from day to day. Finally, we have the fifth and last tier, which is the compatibility filter. And I know at first glance it may seem absurd that you would even consider the perception of others when it comes to relationship compatibility. But long story short, the reason why perception of others is so important is because when you are deciding who to be in a romantic, intimate relationship with, you want to avoid dating people who see you as a project to be improved upon. And you want to avoid dating people that you see as a project to be improved upon. And that can be easier said than done. Ask me how I know. But the compatibility filter as a perception of others as a compatibility filter is really important because it will save you so much heartache in the long run. But we're going to deep dive into what that means and how to go about doing it in the final video of this series called Perception of Others. So, without further ado, we're just going to do kind of like a rapid fire run through of the tiers so I can give you a general overview of what this series is going to look like, and you can decide to stay or you can decide to go. So, biological sex. I know a lot of people expect this conversation to have to do with chromosomes, you know, XX, XY, and all the different conditions called intersex conditions. By the way, the intersex community told me that they wanted them to be called intersex conditions, even though some circles would call that term archaic. You can let me know in the comments what you think. Maybe we can tally it up. I don't know. But biological sex, there are 4 options. And by options, I don't mean conscious choice. I mean that your body is deciding, not you. Not your conscious mind, okay? A, B, C, and D. You are one of these if you are human. And that's just the way it is. However, there are definitely other tiers, let me remind you, of this cake that have to do with opting out, opting in, and feelings and emotions, and those tiers are beautiful, and we will give them their time of day, but that is not this tier, okay? Because this tier is physical only. And in terms of physicality only, we are speaking of gametes. And of gametes, humans are a sexually dimorphic species. There are 2 gametes, ovum and sperm, and that is why there are 2 sexes. So anyone, of course, can say that they're not a female or not a male. Say whatever you want, absolutely 100%. But there are still only 2 gametes, and that's how humanity is created. If anyone discovers a 3rd one, let me know. I'm going to have to completely overhaul this series, and I'm going to have to do some soul searching about how bad a researcher I am. Like, how did I not discover this in like 10 years of looking into this subject? But anyway, your body is either a body that makes sperm, a body that makes eggs, a body or ovum, a body that makes sperm and ovum, or a body that makes neither sperm nor ovum. Those are the 4 categories, and every human being fits into those 4 categories. We're going to talk more deeply about that later. I have this feeling, and like I keep having this thought that people are like, you're not giving enough information, but it's like, this would be like a 3-hour video, because I'm a yapper, okay? There's a reason why this is split up into a series. So we are going to be focused, when we discuss in the biological sex video, we're going to be focused more on the gametes, and chromosomes do not even enter the equation. So we will not be talking about them at all. I just wanted you to know that. As far as biological sex is concerned, like I said, there's A, B, C, and D. Ovum, sperm, both, or neither. And I couldn't find any verifiable evidence that said a human has been born that is completely neuter, meaning not born with any reproductive system whatsoever. And then I also could not find any verifiable evidence that a human was born and able to produce a healthy male and female, I said that sentence poorly. I also wasn't able to find a verifiable source that said, that told the story about a human being that was successfully able to be the biological mother and father of a healthy child. I'm not saying it's completely impossible, and I did find a story, but I couldn't find verifiable sources that it was true. So if you do find that, please let me know. But that would be the only case in which, medically speaking, a person could sensibly identify as both a male and a female. But we're gonna talk about that more in the video that is specifically related to biological sex. Next, we have biogender. Biogender, as I spoke about earlier, is in reference to the behavioral characteristics that are statistically significantly more likely based on what your biological sex is. Again, there will always be outliers. Outliers 100% deserve to be respected. I myself am an outlier in multiple different areas, and I feel like I deserve to be respected, but the exception does not negate the rule. So when we are speaking of biogender, we are speaking about being a man or a woman. However, this is not information that is owed anyone else. So these are not terms you would need to identify as. Kind of like how I say to people that you don't have to identify as cisgender, but people are using cisgender to communicate something to you. And if you aren't listening to them because you are turned off by the word cisgender, then you might be missing valuable information. This is kind of like that. If you are turned off by the words man and woman, then you might be ignoring me after this, and therefore missing information that you could find valuable one day. So just hear me out, both sides, okay? Like I said, the prefix bio is meant to signify a scientific/medical reasoning. So these are not categories that you would need to identify into or have, conversations with other people about unless you so chose. All right, so now we're going to get into the next tier, which is gender identity, and this one has a chart. I love charts and diagrams. This chart is a lot more complicated than the one you're about to see pop up on the screen, okay? In fact, there's an entire video of me going through every single box and box inside the box of this chart. I'm just showing you a general example of a summary of what this looks like. But basically I'm putting it in this, I am putting it here so that I can say there is a such thing as being non-binary and cisgender, even though it does seem, if you know anything about these words and anything about this community, it does seem at first glance like a contradiction. But in the gender identity video, I explain how it's not a contradiction, so I encourage you to check that video out because you may end up seeing something that gives you something to think about that you've never considered before. And that's really the whole purpose for these videos, is giving people something to think about that they've never thought about before. Next order of business, we are going to discuss gender expression. So in the gender expression video, I give you a diagram that's an arrow, and the arrow is feelings of masculinity in the blue side of the continuum, and then feelings of femininity in the pink side of the continuum. And those feelings are what people interpret and show based, they base their expression, whether that's behaviors or appearance, they base that expression on those feelings. So even though you, as someone who is perceiving another person, might not be able to tell what they're feeling exactly, you can see how they're choosing to express, okay? Or hear. Depends. Some people change their voices depending on how they're feeling. Okay. My arrow disappears after every time I press it, so this program is kind of garbage. Okay. Another thing that we're going to be talking about in the gender, I don't remember if this is in the gender identity or the gender expression one, but we're going to talk about map versus territory and how the map that you use to get you to like a buried treasure is not exactly the same as traversing the terrain. So the map is pink versus blue, 100% femininity, 100% masculinity. It's like a versus type of situation. But the territory is more like this. So I put a couple of options here because I wanted to make everybody feel included. I myself don't really acknowledge the concept of 100% masculine or 100% feminine because it's all completely and totally subjective, okay? There's a lot of emotion in this tier of the cake, right? So it's all subjective. Unlike the bottom part of the cake, this part of the cake is how you feel. So what one person considers as 100% masculine is going to be different than what another person considers 100% masculine, When I am at my personal 100% masculine, I'm still exuding this feminine vibe. I can't lower my voice that much. I'm just not going to be the most masculine, right? But by the same token, when I'm at my 100% feminine, there are going to be people who are like, oh, that is too masculine. And they would even laugh at the idea that I consider myself 100% feminine in that moment. But that's okay, because it's subjective, all right? And the fact that it is so subjective is why I use the purple arrow for myself. Because for me, when I'm perceiving someone, I'm perceiving them as more masculine than feminine in that moment, or more feminine than masculine in that moment, based on my perception, because there is no such thing as objectivity when it comes to this subject. But I do know that there are people who do believe that there is objectivity, and that is why this top arrow is there, because I wanted them to feel included as well. So you can choose which one makes the most sense to you based on how you feel. Ironically enough, with that top one. Oh my god, this is the worst arrow. Okay. So, finally, last tier of the cake is perception of others. So the perception of others has to do with how others perceive you, essentially, and that's how you pick. What was I saying? I don't remember. Okay, focus, Embra. Perception of others and gender expression are right next to each other on the cake, right? Those are the tiers. Those two tiers are touching each other. The perception of others, when others are perceiving you, all they have access to is how you choose to express. That's it. They can't see all the way down your cake. They can't see anything else. All they can see is your expression. Same thing is also true the other way around, okay? When you are perceiving other people, you only have access to the way that they choose to express themselves, and that's it. You do not have definitive information about any of the other tiers of their cake, and that's okay. And not only is that okay, but it's going to continue to happen more and more often as society in general gets more and more comfortable in its own skin. So, take a look at this. This is a really important thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to bring this up in more than one presentation, okay? All of these people are saying that they're happy. Who am I to look at their facial expression alone and try to tell them that they're wrong? Because there are people who don't emote very much from their face, and so when they tell you that they're happy, they mean it. They just don't look how society would deem it appropriate for them to look in order to be happy. And the people on the left, maybe they're happy, right? But also, there are people who look happy, who sound happy, and you would never guess that they're contemplating suicide, okay? Because maybe they seem to outwardly love everything about their life. They love their friends, they love their family or whatever, but their hearts are just breaking because of personal issues, all right? Technically, you don't know. And there have been so many cases where, taking this concept, right, and putting it into gender expression, there have been so many cases where people will be perceiving others and make incorrect assumptions about lower tiers of the cake because of how they perceived someone at the top layer. And that's not fair, you know? And we should keep that in mind when we are perceiving people, is that how we think they should express is not necessarily how they are going to express. Okay, so that is all 5 tiers of the cake. Yay, we did it. Okay, so that's all 5 tiers of the cake. If you enjoyed that overview and would like to do more of a deep dive into this, each tier and each, concept, please stick around, because I have 5 other videos that I think you will enjoy. And I look forward to seeing how you choose to engage with the content. Bye!